Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. Our episode today is word power, and we will focus in this word power episode on words that have to do with quantity and amount. But before we do that, let me remind you that you can find the transcript of this episode in a link I will leave in the description. You will also find a link that will take you to Patreon, where you can become patrons of English Plus Podcast and support the show. And by doing that, you will get premium PDF practice worksheets with every single episode we create. There's also another link that will take you to our mailing list. You can subscribe to our mailing list and get updates every 2 weeks on our schedule with selected premium PDF worksheets that we share with our mailing list subscribers. Now, with that being said, let's not waste any more time and let's start with our word power, words that have to do with quality and amount. So now let's jump right in and talk about our first example. The heavy winter snows and the warm spring weather caused an abundance of water to flow down the mountain streams. The word that I want to focus on here is abundance. A-B-U-N-D-A-N-C-E. Abundance. Now, if you look at this word and if you look at the context, what do you think that means? Do you think it means absence, generous amount, unusually small amount, or shallow pool? When we talk about abundance, the heavy winter, we talk about a lot of snow, and now we're talking about abundance of water flowing down the mountain streams. Is it absence, shallow pool, or is it a generous amount? Well, actually, abundance means a generous amount. An abundance of something is a large quantity of it. So that was our first example and our first word. Let's jump to our next example and our second word. Our guide seemed certain we had brought an adequate supply of food for the hike. Any more would be too heavy to carry. So the word is adequate. Remember, we're talking about words that have to do with quantity and amount, and that was our first word, abundance, that has to do with that, and this is the second word, adequate, that also has to do with quantity and amount. So, adequate is spelled A-D-E-Q-U-A-T-E, adequate. What do you think it means? Does it mean uncertain, incomplete, dangerously low, or satisfactory? Now here, this example doesn't tell us that there is something wrong. The guide seemed certain we had brought an adequate supply of food for the hike. Any more would be too heavy to carry. There's no need. So obviously adequate means satisfactory. If something is adequate, there's enough of it, or it is good enough to be used or accepted. So that is adequate. Now let's move on to our next example. The perfect weather and rich soil assured us of an ample crop of vegetables. The word here is ample, A-M-P-L-E. So here, what are we talking about? Are we talking about more than enough, early, weak, or thin, or insufficient? Now, remember, you always try to look for clues in the sentence. So if we look at the sentence here, we say the perfect weather. So we're talking about something positive. It can't be insufficient. It can't be weak or thin. When we talk about ample, we're talking about more than enough. If there's an ample amount of something, there's enough of it and usually some extra. So that was ample. Now for our next example. After the huge meal and dessert, Harvey could hardly get his belt around his bloated stomach. So our word here is bloated. B-L-O-A-T-E-D. Bloated. What do you think that means? Does it mean empty, swollen, reduced, or rigid? Which one has the closest meaning to bloated? We're talking about a big meal. We're talking about a lot of dessert. Harvey could hardly get his belt around his bloated stomach. So we're definitely not talking about an empty stomach. We're obviously talking about swollen. If somebody's body or part of their body is bloated, it is much larger than normal, usually because it has a lot of liquid or gas inside it. And that is exactly how Harvey's stomach was like. So that was bloated. Now let's move on to the next example. Thanks to a bounteous harvest, the farmer was able to rent out part of his land and purchase some new machinery. So here our word is bounteous. B-O-U-N-T-E-O-U-S. Bounteous. Now, if you want to think about the word bounteous, do you think it's close in meaning to barely enough, puny, plentiful, or poor? Now, here, if we look at the sentence again, we will see that we have some good things that happened as a result of this bounteous harvest. The farmer was able to rent out part of his land and purchase some new machinery, so that was good. It's definitely not poor. It's definitely not barely enough or puny. It is plentiful. To be bounteous is to be plentiful and abundant and to be giving freely and generously. That is bounteous. And now let's move on to talk about deficiency. Let's take a look at this example. A deficiency of certain vitamins in your diet can cause you to feel weak and listless. So the word here is deficiency. D-E-F-I-C-I-E-N-C-Y. Deficiency. Now here, are we talking about a large supply? Are we talking about a surplus, an overflow, or shortage? Which has a close meaning to deficiency. Now, if you look at the sentence, remember, always try to look for clues in the context. If you don't remember the word, or if it is a completely new word, try to look for clues in the sentence or obviously in texts, and you will mostly find something that will tell you what this word is about, at least if it is a positive word or a negative word. Now, obviously, we're talking about the results of deficiency of a vitamin or certain vitamins that can cause you to feel weak and listless. So we're not talking about a positive thing at all. We're not talking about a large supply, surplus, or overflow. We're talking about shortage, something negative. So that was deficiency. Now let's move on to talk about the next word, negligible. The difference in the price of the two cars was negligible, so we bought the one we liked best. So negligible is spelled N-E-G-L-I-G-I-B-L-E, negligible. So here, when we look at this sentence, and negligible in the context of the sentence, what does it mean? Does it mean not worth considering? Does it mean great, surprising, or wide? What do you think? Now here, if we think about the sentence again, we can see that the difference in the price did not help them decide or was not the main factor why they decided to buy this car or that car, because the difference was not big, was negligible. So they bought the one they liked the best because the price difference was not an issue. So which do you think is closer in meaning to negligible? Obviously, we're talking about not worth considering. It's definitely not great, wide, or surprising. Negligible, it's not worth considering. An amount or effect that is negligible is so small that it is not worth considering or worrying about. So now let's move on to the next word, saturate. The broken drain pipe dripped water for days and saturated the carpet with dirty water. So saturate is spelled S-A-T-U-R-A-T-E, saturate. So here, saturate, we're talking about a broken drain pipe. It dripped water for days and it saturated the carpet. What does that mean? Emptied the carpet, filled completely, drained, or expanded. Now, here, obviously, we're talking about water dripping for days. And what happened to that poor carpet? It was saturated. It was filled completely. It doesn't have to do with empty or drain. It's just the opposite. It was filled completely. The problem that the water was dirty. It was filled completely with dirty water. So, of course, if something or someone is saturated, they become extremely wet. But we can use saturate in a different meaning that is quite commonly used as well. If people or things saturate a place or object, they fill it completely so that no more can be added. Sometimes you can feel saturated. You can hear no more of this kind of music, or you can watch no more of this kind of movies or series, and so on. So you get the idea. That is the word saturate. Now let's move on to talk about the next word, scarcity. A scarcity of food in the area caused the buffalo to move further south where vegetation could usually be found. So here we're talking about the scarcity and how it affected the buffalo and it made the buffalo move. But here, let's start first by talking about the spelling of this word, S-C-A-R-C-I-T-Y, scarcity. What does that mean? The scarcity of food in the area caused the buffalo to move further south where vegetation could usually be found. What does that mean? Does that mean abundance, unknown amount, lack, or growing volume? So obviously we're not talking about something that is there. We have scarcity here because if there were food in the area, the buffalo wouldn't move. But the buffalo moved further south where they could find food. So here we're not talking about abundance. We're not talking about growing volume, we're talking about lack. So that was scarcity. If there is a scarcity of something, there is not enough of it for the people who need it or want it. And now for our last word for this episode, and that is voluminous. Let's take a look at this example. The apartment was rather small, but it did have voluminous closets for storing all my winter clothes. So, voluminous is spelled Voluminous. Voluminous. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean narrow and long? Does it mean small in number, tall, or having great size? Now, here we're talking about the apartment, which is small. So maybe we're talking about small, but then we're talking about voluminous closets, and it was enough for storing all my winter clothes. So we're definitely not talking about something small. We're not talking about narrow and long. We're not talking about small in number. We're talking about something that has great size. And that is the meaning of voluminous. Something that is voluminous is very large or contains a lot of things. So these were the 10 words I wanted to share with you in this episode of Word Power. The words today had to do with quantity and amount. I hope you found the words useful. Don't forget that you can practice these words in the PDF practice worksheets that you can get by becoming a patron of the show on Patreon. And with that being said, let me remind you that you can find the transcript of this episode in a link I will leave in the description, and you will also find another link that will take you to our mailing list where you can subscribe. And by doing that, you will get updates on our schedule every 2 weeks, and you will get selected premium PDF worksheets specially sent for our mailing list subscribers. With that being said, thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.